When Mark and I moved to Cedar Hollow, we weren't looking for a waterfall. We were looking for space. After 8 years in a cramped city townhouse, and with our daughter Emily on the way, we wanted somewhere she could run around and grow up without a shared wall on either side of her bedroom. The property we found was more than we expected. 42 acres, most of it wooded, with a spring-fed creek that ran along the eastern edge and dropped, near the back property line, over a rock ledge into a shallow pool below. The waterfall wasn't Niagara, but it was ours, and it was gorgeous, especially in spring, when the snowmelt fed the creek and the water roared loud enough to hear from the back porch. The property belonged to a small HOA called Cedar Hollow Estates, which governed about 60 homes spread across large wooded lots. The dues were reasonable, the covenants were mostly about paint colors and fence heights, and for the first 4 years, I barely thought about the HOA at all. I paid my dues, went to maybe one annual meeting a year, and let the board, led by a woman named Denise Calloway, handle whatever business there was to handle. Denise had been HOA president for almost a decade. She was the kind of person who introduced herself with her title. Denise Calloway, HOA president, was practically stitched onto her jacket. She ran board meetings like she was chairing a Fortune 500 company, with an agenda, a gavel, and very little patience for questions from residents who weren't on the board. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I didn't hate Denise. I didn't even dislike her, not at first. She was intense, sure, and a little too fond of her own authority, but she also organized the neighborhood 4th of July picnic every year and made sure the community entrance sign always had fresh flowers. She seemed, on the surface, like someone who genuinely loved Cedar Hollow. What I didn't know was that Denise loved something else about Cedar Hollow even more, the money that could be made from it. The strangers in my backyard. It started small. In the spring of our 5th year, I noticed cars parked along the gravel access road behind our lot, a road technically owned by the HOA, used mostly by maintenance trucks and the occasional dog walker. At first, it was 1 or 2 cars a week. Then it became several a day, especially on weekends. I mentioned it to Mark, half joking that maybe Cedar Hollow had become a secret hiking destination. He laughed it off. Probably just people using the road as a shortcut, he said. But then, one Saturday afternoon in June, I walked out to the tree line behind our property to check on a fence post that had come loose, and I heard voices. Multiple voices. Adult voices, kids laughing, someone saying, "Right through here, folks, watch your step on the rocks." I followed the sound, and what I found stopped me in my tracks. There were at least 15 people standing at the edge of my waterfall, 40 feet behind my property line, on land I owned outright, land I paid taxes on every single year. They had cameras out. Someone was filming a video for what looked like a travel vlog. A man in a green polo shirt with a laminated badge clipped to his shirt pocket was standing near the pool below the falls, talking like a tour guide. "This is one of the most photographed spots in the county," he was saying. "The falls drop about 40 feet, and if you look up top, you can actually see where the creek splits before it comes down. Great spot for pictures. We ask everyone to stay behind the rope for safety." There was rope. Actual nylon rope, strung between 2 trees, cordoning off a viewing area, on my land. I stood there for a solid 10 seconds just processing what I was looking at. Then I walked forward and asked, as calmly as I could manage, "Excuse me, what exactly is going on here?" The man in the green polo shirt turned to me with the easy, practiced smile of someone used to fielding questions from confused visitors. "Hey there. Welcome to Doyle Falls. Are you looking to join the tour, or just passing through? If you're joining, it's $15 for adults, 10 for kids under 12.
$15.
To visit my own backyard. This is my property," I said. "You're standing on my land, and so is everyone else here." He blinked, clearly thrown, and then reached for a laminated map from a folder tucked under his arm. "This is Cedar Hollow Estates community land. It's all mapped out. The HOA runs the falls tour every weekend, has for a while now. If there's a boundary dispute, you'd want to talk to the HOA office." I didn't yell. I want to be honest about that, because I know how these stories can go, and I know it would be satisfying to tell you I flipped a table and started screaming. I didn't. I was too stunned. I asked the group to please step back off my land, apologized to the confused tourists, most of whom had clearly paid good money and had no idea they were trespassing, and I walked back to the house in a daze. Mark was waiting on the porch. I told him what I'd seen. He didn't believe me at first either. That night, We pulled out the property survey from when we bought the house. The waterfall was, without question, on our land, nearly 60 feet inside our boundary line, well past the HOA's easement for the maintenance road. There was no ambiguity, no shared ownership, no community land designation. It was ours. So the next morning, I called the HOA office and asked to speak with Denise Calloway. It's been a community asset for years. Denise agreed to meet with me at the HOA clubhouse 2 days later. I brought the survey. I brought photos I'd taken of the rope, the sign, and the man in the green polo shirt. I brought a printed copy of my deed. Denise listened to me with the calm, slightly condescending patience of someone explaining something to a child. When I finished, she folded her hands on the table and said, "Rachel, I understand this is a surprise to you, but the Falls Tour has been part of Cedar Hollow's identity for almost 3 years now. It brings a wonderful sense of community pride. People come from all over the county. It's on my land, Denise. The access road is HOA property," she said. "And frankly, the exact property line back there has never been something residents worried too much about. We've always treated that whole wooded section as shared green space." "It's not shared green space. It's my backyard. I have a deed. I have a survey. I pay property taxes on every inch of it, including the 40 feet around that waterfall." Denise's smile tightened, just slightly. "I'll be honest with you. This tour generates revenue that keeps our dues lower than most HOAs in the county. If we lost that income, dues would likely go up for everyone, including you. I'd hate for this to become a point of contention in the neighborhood." That last part felt less like an explanation and more like a warning. I asked her directly, how much revenue, exactly, was the Falls Tour generating? She said she didn't have exact figures on hand, but that it was significant. I asked who was collecting the money and where it went. She said it went into the HOA's general operating account, same as dues. I left with more questions than answers, and a distinct feeling that Denise had no intention of stopping the tours. She was simply hoping I'd be talked out of caring. She was wrong. Digging into the books. I spent the next 2 weeks doing something Denise clearly hadn't expected: research. As a homeowner, I had a legal right to request financial records and meeting minutes. Most people never bother. I did. I submitted a formal written request for 2 years of financial statements and any documents related to what the HOA was calling the Cedar Hollow Nature Experience, the official name, I learned from a flyer on the clubhouse bulletin board, of the guided waterfall tours. The HOA bylaws required a response within 30 days. It took Denise 41, and when the documents finally arrived, they were incomplete, pages missing, several months of revenue entries lumped together under a vague line item labeled community programming income, with no itemization. But even the incomplete records told me enough. Over roughly 2.5 years, the Cedar Hollow Nature Experience tours had generated an estimated total of well over $60,000. Tours ran most weekends, sometimes twice a day during peak season, at $15 per adult and $10 per child, with groups often numbering 15 to 25 people. Some entries referenced merchandise sales. Apparently there were branded t-shirts and water bottles sold at a folding table near the trailhead. There were even a few entries referencing partnerships with local tour companies, and a listing on a regional tourism website that described Doyle Falls as a hidden gem accessible through guided community tours. The money wasn't just going toward lower HOA dues, either. Buried in an expense column, I found reimbursements to board members for things like site maintenance supplies, tour equipment, and, this one stuck with me, a $3,200 payment described only as administrative stipend, D. Calloway. I wasn't an accountant, but I knew enough to recognize the shape of something that needed a closer look. I made copies of everything, saved digital scans in 3 separate places, and started asking around the neighborhood, carefully and quietly, about what other residents knew. What I learned was that almost nobody knew the full picture. A few people vaguely remembered Denise mentioning the nature walks at an annual meeting years back, framed as a fun community outreach event, maybe a way to build goodwill with the county. Nobody remembered voting on turning it into a for-profit weekend tourist operation. Nobody remembered voting on using someone's private backyard waterfall as the centerpiece of it. And certainly nobody remembered any of that $60,000 plus being distributed back to homeowners in the form of reduced dues, which had actually gone up twice in the past 3 years, not down. I brought this to Mark. We talked about lawyers. We talked about the sheriff's department. But before any of that, I decided there was something more immediate I needed to do, because that Saturday, the tours were scheduled to run again, and I was done letting strangers walk through my land while I waited for a slow bureaucratic process to cat the fence. I'm not a naturally confrontational person. Ask anyone who knows me. I'm the one who lets people cut in line at the grocery store because I don't want to make a scene. But something about standing in my own backyard and being asked for $15 by a stranger flipped a switch in me that hasn't fully turned back off since. On a Friday evening, after Denise's 41-day, half-answered records request had confirmed everything I feared, I drove 40 minutes to the nearest home improvement store and bought 400 feet of 6-foot chain link fencing, metal posts, concrete mix, a post hole digger, and enough no trespassing, private property signage to make sure nobody could claim confusion ever again. Mark thought I was overreacting when I unloaded the truck. Then I showed him, again, the deed, the survey, the financial records, the $3,200 administrative stipend. By the time I finished laying it all out on the kitchen table, he was already grabbing his work gloves. We worked through the night. It sounds more dramatic than it was. Mostly it was two exhausted, sweaty, mosquito-bitten adults digging post holes by headlamp while our neighbor's dog barked periodically at us from across the tree line. We didn't fence off the whole property, just the section around the waterfall and the approach path from the HOA access road, a boundary that ran entirely, unambiguously inside my legal property line, verified against the survey stakes we drove in first. By 6 a.m, as the sun was coming up, the fence was up. A locked gate blocked the worn dirt path that had clearly been trampled down by 2.5 years of weekend tour groups. I zip-tied a laminated copy of the property survey to the gate, right next to a sign that read, "Private property, no trespassing, violators will be prosecuted." I stood there in the early morning light, filthy, exhausted, and strangely proud of myself. Then I went inside, made coffee, and waited. The reaction. I didn't have to wait long. By 9:30 that morning, my phone rang. It was Denise. "Rachel, there's a fence blocking the falls trail. Do you know anything about that?" "I do," I said. "I built it." There was a long pause. "You can't just fence off community land." "It's not community land, Denise. It's my land. You have the survey. I gave you a copy myself. There are tours scheduled today. People have already paid." That sentence told me everything I needed to know about where her priorities Saturday. Not "I'm sorry, we'll refund people and figure this out." Not "let's sit down and sort out the property line properly." Just, "people have already paid." "Then I'd suggest you refund them," I said, "because nobody is walking through that gate." She hung up on me. Within the hour, cars started showing up at the access road, the same green polo shirt tour guide, along with what I assumed was a group of ticket holders, standing confused at a locked chain link gate where a well-worn trail used to be. I watched from a distance as the guide made a phone call, gestured at the fence, and eventually turned the group around. I felt a small, guilty flicker of sympathy for the tourists, who genuinely had no idea they'd paid to trespass on private property for 2.5 years. But my sympathy didn't extend to Denise. By that afternoon, I had 3 voicemails from HOA board members, an email marked urgent, violation of architectural guidelines, and a letter taped to my mailbox threatening a $500 per day fine for unauthorized fencing not approved by the Architectural Review Committee. This is the moment a lot of HOA disputes go sideways for homeowners, because HOAs love to weaponize their own bylaws, even when they're the ones acting illegally. Denise knew the fence violated the guidelines on paper: height, material, no prior approval, and she was banking on scaring me into taking it down before anyone looked too closely at why I'd put it up in the first place. It almost worked, for about an afternoon. Then I called a lawyer, bringing in backup. I found a real estate attorney 2 counties over, someone with no ties to Cedar Hollow or its HOA, named Priya Anand. I brought her the deed, the survey, the incomplete financial records, and copies of the threatening letters. Priya's red was blunt. The fence, sitting entirely on my private property along a surveyed line, was legal regardless of the HOA's architectural guidelines on height or materials, because HOA covenants can't override a homeowner's fundamental right to prevent trespassing, especially not to protect an unauthorized commercial operation the HOA had been running on that land without consent. More importantly, she flagged something I hadn't fully considered. If the HOA had, in fact, been collecting money from the public to access private property without the owner's consent, for years, that wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. That was potentially trespassing at an organizational level, unjust enrichment, and depending on how those funds were being handled, especially that administrative stipend, possibly something a lot more serious. Priya drafted a formal cease and desist letter to the HOA board, laying out the property line, demanding an immediate and permanent halt to any tours or public access on my land, and formally requesting a full, itemized accounting of every dollar collected under the Cedar Hollow Nature Experience program, along with disclosure of where those funds had gone. She also recommended I file a report with the county sheriff's office, not to press charges immediately, but to establish an official record of the trespassing and unauthorized commercial activity. I did. A deputy came out, reviewed the survey, took photos of the old rope line and the worn trail, and confirmed in his report that the waterfall and viewing area sat well within my property boundary. Denise's response to the cease and desist letter was not what I expected. Instead of backing down, she called an emergency HOA board meeting and framed the entire situation, to the whole neighborhood, as me, quote, attempting to seize community resources for personal gain. That, it turned out, was the mistake that finally brought the whole thing crashing down. The emergency meeting. I decided to attend the emergency meeting. Not to yell, not to make a scene, but because I wanted every resident in that room to hear the truth directly from me, with documents in hand, before Denise had a chance to spin it any further. The clubhouse was packed, more people than I'd ever seen at a Cedar Hollow meeting, probably 40 or 50 residents crammed into folding chairs. Denise opened by describing the situation exactly as she'd framed it in her earlier emails. A beloved community nature program, suddenly and unilaterally shut down by one homeowner who had erected an unauthorized fence in violation of HOA guidelines. When she opened the floor for comments, I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply held up the property survey, the deed, and a printed copy of the financial records the HOA itself had provided me, records that showed over $60,000 in tour revenue collected over 2.5 years, a figure I read aloud slowly, twice, so it would sink in. I explained that the waterfall sat entirely on my private property, 60 feet inside my boundary line, verified by both my own survey and, now, by the county sheriff's department. I explained that I had never been asked, consulted, or compensated for 2.5 years of strangers walking through my land. And then I read aloud, word for word, the line item labeled Administrative Stipend, D. Calloway, $3,200. The room went very quiet. Denise tried to interject, insisting the stipend was standard practice for board members managing special programming, approved by a board vote that, when pressed, she couldn't actually produce documentation for. Several residents, people who had never even known the tours existed, let alone that HOA dues weren't going down despite the revenue, started asking their own questions. Where else was money being spent without proper disclosure? Why hadn't the tours ever come up for a homeowner vote? Why had the annual budget reports never itemized this income separately? One resident, an older man named Frank who'd lived in Cedar Hollow since before Denise joined the board, stood up and said what became the turning point of the meeting. I've been paying dues here for 18 years, and I just found out we've been running a tourist attraction on someone's private backyard without her permission, and using the money for stipends we never approved. I think it's time for an independent audit, and time for new leadership. The motion for an emergency independent financial audit passed by an overwhelming show of hands that same night. The fallout. The audit took about 6 weeks. What it found was worse than even I had expected. The Cedar Hollow Nature Experience had, in fact, generated over $71,000 across its full run, more than the incomplete records I'd received initially showed, because several months of cash-collected entrance fees appeared to have never been logged in the official books at all. Of that total, only a small fraction, less than $9,000, had ever gone toward anything resembling legitimate community expenses, like the clubhouse landscaping fund. The rest had been distributed through a pattern of vague administrative stipends, board appreciation bonuses, and unitemized operating reserve transfers that, upon closer inspection, trace back disproportionately to accounts and reimbursements connected to Denise and 2 other board members who had helped run the weekend tours. The county followed up on the sheriff's earlier trespassing report, and given the scale and duration of the unauthorized commercial activity on private land, along with the financial irregularities uncovered by the audit, the matter was referred for further investigation into potential theft and misappropriation of HOA funds. I won't pretend to know every legal detail of how that process unfolded. That part moved slowly, the way these things do, through the county prosecutor's office rather than anything I had direct control over. What I do know is that Denise resigned from the HOA board within a week of the audit results being shared with homeowners, along with the 2 other board members implicated in the stipend pattern. A new HOA board was elected within the month, led by Frank and 2 other longtime residents. One of their first official actions was a formal written apology to me and my family, along with a unanimous vote to explicitly designate the waterfall and surrounding 40 feet as my private, undisputed property in all future HOA records and maps, something that, absurdly, had never been formally documented anywhere the HOA controlled. The fence stayed up. I did eventually swap the plain chain link for something a little nicer, a wood and wire combination that blends into the tree line better, but the message stayed exactly the same: private property, no trespassing, no exceptions. What I learned. People sometimes ask me if I feel bad about how abruptly I handled it, fencing off the waterfall overnight instead of going through proper channels first. My honest answer is no. I tried proper channels. I asked Denise directly, calmly, with documentation in hand, and she brushed me off and doubled down. Proper channels only work when the people on the other side of them are acting in good faith. Denise wasn't. What the fence did was simple. It stopped the harm immediately, while I built the case to stop it permanently. It bought time. It created an unmistakable, undeniable line, literally, between what was mine and what wasn't, and it forced a confrontation that a stack of polite emails never would have. I also learned something less satisfying but more important. HOAs run almost entirely on the assumption that homeowners won't ask questions. Denise ran that waterfall tour for 2.5 years because she believed, correctly for a long time, that nobody would request the financial records, verify the property line, or push back when she said the magic words community asset. The moment I did all 3, the entire arrangement collapsed like it was never built on anything solid to begin with, because it wasn't. Today, the waterfall is quiet again, the way it was before Mark and I even knew what an HOA board meeting looked like. Emily, who's 12 now, still swims in the pool below it every summer. Occasionally, a hiker wanders close to the fence line, reads the sign, and turns back without incident. No ropes, no tour guides, no $15 entrance fee, no stranger in a green polo shirt telling anyone where to stand. Just the sound of water, falling exactly where it's supposed to, on land that was always, only, mine.